for a second. Okay, for anyone I haven't met yet, I'm Alyssa. I founded Make Your Design Matter, which is a community for designers that shares resources and conversations like this one to help you confidently grow and sustain your design business. And I also own a design business myself. It's called Amped Designs, and that is where I provide web design and branding services for business owners. And at this point, I have been in business for 6 years. I've been self-employed for 7. And when I started my business, I'll just be totally transparent about this. I had a lot of design experience in branding and print design, and I could design a nice looking website. But as far as building websites, that was kind of the area that I needed to learn the most about. And maybe some of you can relate to this, but I found when I started out that often I hit this wall where I wasn't able to build the thing I designed. Like my design skills were greater than my web building and coding skills. So I started taking courses and doing webinars and finding resources and blogs and like really trying to learn as much as I could about how to build websites and how to code, and like bring my vision to life essentially. And at the same time, the more that I learned about that kind of stuff, it, it just opened the door to so many like amazing possibilities, all these plugins, these crazy features that we can do on websites. And I was getting so excited because I really, I'm sure most designers can relate to this too, but I love like out of the box, unique, creative things. But at the same time, I was also learning about things like SEO and accessibility, like we're talking about today. And sometimes the design things I was finding really conflicted with the things I was reading, and I would kind of stop in my tracks before using a plugin because I would be like, wait a second, like this could have implications on somebody's ability to like use the website or for a screen reader to read it. So then I started looking a little more into accessibility, but I still don't know nearly as much as Andrea, who's my co-host today. Andrea, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Um, Hi, everybody. I'm Andrea Shirey. So I'm the owner of One Nine Design, and just barely a little bit longer than Alyssa here. I started One Nine Design in 2017, and that came after a long career in nonprofit leadership and being marketing director for a couple of different companies where it seemed like my other duties as assigned were always manage the website. And so I really learned website design and website, lots of different website platforms as part of the corporate world and then the nonprofit world. And when I was ready to exit that sort of full-time workforce, and my kids were kind of starting to need a little bit more, and I wanted to be home a little bit more and stop traveling and all those things. I thought I was just going to do a little bit of website design on the side, just here and there. And I really wanted to focus on nonprofits because that's really what I knew. And 7 years later, I've got a full-time growing business in web design, and I love it. It's definitely not it hasn't gone where I thought it would go. But it's been, a very evolving process. And like Alyssa, I started with I have some similarities, and definitely not my design skills were not outpacing my website design skills, but I love to write, and so I could really write copy. I loved writing appeal letters for nonprofits, and so I had all of the copywriting down, and I had to learn the design side, and then I had to learn the technical side of whatever platform I was working with. And as we'll just be honest, both of us are going to be honest with you today, accessibility was not number one on our list when we started these businesses. We weren't thinking about it from day one, but we've both put in the work. And I think what matters and what the message we want to get across today is you're here. It's a great thing that you're here. And I love that you're here because it means that you matter, that it matters that we build inclusive websites for other people to use, and that that it is top of mind for us. It doesn't mean it's your core service offering. It doesn't mean you're going to become an expert or need to be an expert, but it means that you care and that it's important to you. And it's a message that you can carry on to your clients. So, it's now a part of everything I do. I would love to see more designers get to that point. But again, we're not coming from a place of judgment today of like, you have to, you must, you should. It's, hey, let us share with you what we've learned, the process we've gone through, answer some of these questions, hopefully make it a little more digestible, because it can certainly be a very overwhelming topic. If any of you have ever Googled anything about accessibility, you'll know that you're like, whoa, I've had so many students say like, I just got overwhelmed, right? And so, and I quit. So our goal today is to relieve that overwhelm, let you know that we've been where you are, answer the questions we can answer. Yes, I have a certification. I am not an expert. I do not know all of the answers. I am very resourceful, and I'm very lucky to have a community of other leaders that I'm learning from, as well as the community, the disability community. I have great access to them here in the Mid-Ohio Valley where I live and work. And I love that, because I can go right to them and say, hey, you know, if someone's building a website and they want to do this, like, tell me about this from your perspective. No better place to learn than people living with disabilities in your own communities. So.
Yeah. I really appreciated, I think the first time that I talked to you about this, I think, well, okay, I think a lot of us like read things about like people getting sued and all these like legal things, and we start to like freak out. And I
Yes.
really appreciated how you kind of set my mind at ease about like, it's not about being like a total expert. It's not like you can't offer web design if you're not an accessibility expert. It's just about like being aware at least of the foundations and resources to point people to, and just like being open to learning about it. So that was very comforting to me.
Oh, good.
Um, yeah, okay. So we also wanted to suggest before we dive into more info, to maybe try to bring to mind if there is anyone in your life who you know who has either a physical or cognitive disability that might be impacted by things on websites, whether it is visual or how they use a mouse or a keyboard or whatever it may be. And then we also wanted to say, if you have any questions while we're chatting, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll collect them all and we'll answer them at the end. So yeah, so going back to that point about, you know, you read about these lawsuits and companies that purposely like sue people whose websites aren't compliant. Like how important is this? Like how much do our clients actually need to worry about accessibility guidelines?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start, because like you said, many of us have seen those news articles, and I don't know that it's ever a great idea to do something out of fear, right? And so I think that's the basis that we want to get across today is, let's not go into this of, I need to do this because I don't want to get sued, right? Yes, we all have to worry about our legal standing. We need to have, you know, good contracts in place and all those kind of things. But I think if we lead from a place of thinking about the person on the other end that's using the website we're designing, I think this is a blessed place to start. You know, the fact is, inaccessible websites are just they take away freedoms that we don't think about, right? Like you said, reducing the quality of life, making a task difficult that doesn't have to be difficult. My journey in this whole accessibility space started during COVID, when my older son had to navigate online resources for school. And I made a whole bunch of assumptions that would be very easy. He's very intelligent. He had been in public school, you know, for years and years. The website said exactly what to do and how to do it. And here are the 18 steps to follow. And he couldn't do it. And I couldn't figure out why until I said, let me see it. Because I'm over here assuming all the instructions are there, right? The website was so poorly designed and laid out in such a way that for his cognitive abilities, not his intelligence, but the way that he reads and takes in information, visual cues, all those kind of things, it was making it impossible for him to navigate something that was actually a pretty simple task. I ended up copying, pasting the text instructions into a document, and he had it done within an hour. And I thought, oh, it was like this light bulb for me, that disabilities do not mean that someone's in a wheelchair. They don't mean that someone can't use either arm, that they're completely blind. We really tend to forget, or we didn't know to begin with, that disabilities span a big array of cognitive challenges, vision impairment, temporary things. I have my other son broke his wrist back in February. and it was his mouse arm, and he couldn't use the mouse for school. And so I said, hey, let's look at keyboard accessibility. Let's see if any of these sites have keyboard shortcuts. And lo and behold, they did. And so and that was a temporary situation that really impacted him. So does it impact our clients and their clients? I think absolutely. Because let's not limit our view of it, right? We have to think about it as a broad population.
Yeah. I also feel like it's worth noting that so many times we see design as the thing that sets us apart as designers, like for our clients, and we're marketing off of like our design style, but being someone who is actually considering like the user first and is actually thinking about accessibility and the long-term impact on the client's website, like that can be a huge thing that sets you apart from other designers who haven't even like given this a single thought. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, just thinking about like, yeah, how it benefits the user, but also how it benefits our own businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about this, but in your proposals, as designers, it's a great space to talk about this. And it doesn't mean you're putting yourself forward as an expert, like we said, but yeah, but this is on our radar that we know that accessible sites tend to result with longer, visitors staying on the site longer, which increases conversion rates, which is better for SEO. There are all these downstream benefits that have nothing to do with lawsuits. And yes, our gut intuition is to do this for the user, to make an inclusive website, right, that anyone can use. But ultimately, we're going to have to learn how to spin that and how to sell that to a client, because at the end of the day, this may mean that we're charging more, right, because it is requiring more expertise, more knowledge, more continuing education on our part, which means we may need to raise our prices a little bit. But we could easily justify that when the client says like, oh wow, like no one else has mentioned this. We've asked, for 5 proposals, and you're the only one talking about, this experience.
Yeah. And also disclaimer, none of this is legal advice.
Yes, please. Thank you.
We are not lawyers. But that also made me think about, I was talking to a friend who's also a web designer who was bidding for a web design project against a large agency, and the client had been scared off by the agency because the agency came in and was like, these are all these things you have to worry about with accessibility, and like these are the repercussions if you don't do these things. And they went to my friend and she was kind of like, they're blowing it way out of proportion. None of that is important. And I feel like there's a middle ground. It's not that it's not important. So like, yeah, like what are the repercussions? Like how important is this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think Alyssa and I have talked a lot, in the last few weeks about this event today. And I like to use this visual of a continuum. And I think it really helps us look at it through a different lens of like, on this side is like, I'm not thinking about this. I'm not an expert. This isn't my job. I'm just going to put something in my contract that says I'm not responsible for it. And I feel like that's over here. And then over here is somebody who's got certification. It's impacting every design decision. You're nitpicking over every single paragraph, every image, and then there's obviously all this space in between. But, the fact is there are repercussions of an inaccessible site. There's no way around it. So there are 2 things that I'll highlight that I think are important for us just to know. You can Google these. I would recommend that you do, and you sort of copy some language and just have it handy if a client does start to ask you questions. But essentially, and these are going to be US laws. So I am not an expert or up on, the sort of the nitty gritty differences between, countries. But in the United States, we have oh boy, I just blanked on I have the acronym written down, the American Disabilities Act, the ADA, which requires that businesses provide equal access to services. So if we think about this as a physical building, right? If you were building a building, you would know pretty easily you have to have a handicap accessible interest, right? You've got to have a ramp. If you have only stairs in the front of your building, your doorways have to be wide enough for a wheelchair to fit through. If you have an elevator, or I'm sorry, if you have stairs, most buildings now require an elevator. All those things are ADA laws, right? What most people don't realize is that is inclusive of digital services like websites. And so if you're putting information out via your website, it has to be accessible to individuals with disabilities. If it's not, the ADA or a client or even an advocacy group on behalf of a client can sue your business under the ADA laws, right? Saying that you are not providing equal access to services. So it's kind of just a basic law that's out there. And then getting a little more nitty gritty, you have the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, and that applies to federal agencies and contractors. So probably not applicable here today, but again, it requires electronic and information technology to be accessible. So those are kind of the two big basic laws. There are a lot of other individual components of those, but when it comes down to it, we're required as businesses to provide equal access to services. That means the information we share for our own businesses should be ADA accessible. And then therefore we're sort of taking that on client work, assuring our clients that we're going to keep that in mind as we build their website. They're paying us to basically create this communication vehicle. And so we want to do that with these in mind.
I love
And
that. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yes, it can end in a lawsuit, most likely. And again, not legal advice, just anecdotal experience and from research that I've done, courses that I've taken. Most of the time, that first step is a letter from someone, right? It's a letter from somebody who couldn't access your website, somebody who couldn't get the information that they needed in the way that they needed it. And they're basically going to give you a warning as, hey, what you're putting out there isn't working for me, right? Please correct it. Please send me the information. And, hopefully you don't even get to that point, but it would take a big, I think I'm not sure what the word is here. Like it would be sort of extreme, I think, for somebody to just go straight to a lawsuit with individual web designer on behalf of a client.
Yeah. And I really love that comparison to like a physical building. I think we don't really think about that, but that's such a good way to word it, especially if you're trying to help a client understand. Right. Because it's like someone is visiting their business online. I feel like if a client, if you're working with a client that's like not sure why this matters, trying to understand, like that's a really good comparison. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I feel like we're kind of talking about like the broad impacts of accessibility, but maybe we could give some examples of like what isn't accessible that like
that's a good idea.
Yeah, a lot of. So I feel like, well, so I mentioned that I kind of was noticing all these plugins and all these fancy features and things that I got excited about, and then kind of was like, wait a second. I feel like a lot of things that we're seeing lately are about like changing the layout so it's no longer traditionally like in order, it scrolls weird. And I think people are like wanting to capitalize on like being unique and doing something that's like never been seen before. But when it comes to like a website, because of all the things we just talked about, that's not really a good thing. So
unless you're designing for, somebody who's really cutting edge and needs all that on display, in which case there are tools to make them accessible. In general, I think you're absolutely correct. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So I would say like some of the specific features that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that I would generally recommend avoiding are things like side scrolling, especially if the entire site is doing that. Things that are, you have to like hover over things in order to reveal the information, like the information isn't already there. Things that are automatically moving, like lots of animations, like weird placement of navigation menus. So like hidden, I think like with the hamburger menu on desktop, anyone who's like in my generation, like 30s and younger, will probably know to click that. But like my parents might not.
Right. Where is the homepage? Where is the about page? I saw one today that it was not only just a hamburger, but it was like the lines inside were like wiggly, which I love my squiggly lines, right? But like it, for some reason, it didn't even occur to me that like that was the menu. I was like, oh, wow, that's weird.
I mean, I feel like I see a lot of things that are definitely not intuitive, but I have to.
That's Clark. Is that a lettuce burger? That's a great. I didn't know it was a name, but if that's not a name, you named it. Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I'll see a lot of things that I have to like think about how to use, and I'm pretty tech savvy. So if I have to think about it, like imagine someone who like isn't studying websites every day.
Right. The
Um,
other one is there's a big trend, and I think it looks really cool of doing vertical text like
oh, yeah.
beside boxes, and it looks great. And it's one of those that I'm just like, oh, I really like how it looks. And I think there's probably a place for it here and there, but it couldn't be the primary text that's identifying that section of the site. It's just not gonna, in most cases, depending on how it's designed. I do have to say there are options there, but that's another one that just came to mind as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and then on in regards to design, I feel like a lot of things, this isn't even just web design, this is across the board, but there's a lot of like tone on tone, very small fonts, very thin fonts. And it's kind of, I feel like sometimes it's this battle between aesthetics and like feeling on brand and doing something accessible. So I feel like there is this push to like change the traditional layout of a website just to make it like look cool. And I find it to be an interesting creative challenge to stay within the brand and to do something that is creative and different, but still follow like the traditional layout and
Right.
make sure that it's easy for, yeah.
I try to, I just want to make a quick chat, Matt. We're going to come back to your question. You're definitely on the right track there. We're going to talk about accessibility statements and why I think they're so important, and that's kind of what your question was getting to. But so when I'm designing a site, these days, sort of post accessibility knowledge, I will kind of almost do a boring version first. And then I go back and think, what can I add? What can I add that still keeps the site accessible? That's a little bit unique. Every client, I try to give them like one thing that another client didn't get that I haven't done before. Sometimes that is a plugin, but you better bet I've looked at that plugin code. I know how that's going to affect the site speed, how it's going to load. I've tested it on a screen reader. I've gone through the steps to make sure it's going to work. Somebody said, doesn't mean we can never do X, Y, and Z. I don't think I would ever say you can never do a thing. I think that the compromise is if I'm going to put this on the site, have I tested it? Do I know that it's going to, what kind of red flags is it going to give me in the accessibility checkers? And then let's have a conversation with the client. Is the client demanding that feature? Well, in some cases, you're going to have to default to the client. They've paid you to do work. You can kind of do your own disclaimers, and you did your best. That accessibility statement is going to come into play in those situations. But if you're just doing it just for the sake of being different, I think there are other ways to set ourselves apart.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I really appreciate the questions in the chat. I'm putting them in our document so we can answer
Oh,
them.
awesome. Yes, because I do have a preferred screen reader testing. And I'll pull up the link when we're done.
Yeah, or if you feel like it makes sense to like wrap any of them into our current conversation,
Okay.
that's fine too.
Gotcha.
Okay. And I feel like another big consideration is yeah, the client's audience. So like I mentioned with the hamburger thing, like some features, if their entire target audience is Gen Z, I feel like that's more of a justification for things that are a little bit more like breaking the norms because
Sure. Mhm.
they're so used to like experimenting and like just really quickly figuring out technology. But if the target audience is like, 65 and older, then it's going to be really difficult. And those people are probably going to use patience or lose patience with stuff that is
Right.
just not standard. So, um, yeah. And then I think when we were talking, Andrea, you brought up the point, like, do you think the client's audience even cares about the unique features as much as you do?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important to ask ourselves, like, are we doing this to make ourselves look good? Which we all care about that, right? I'm not going to say we don't. Yes, I want somebody to look at a site and be like, wow, when I
Yeah.
design it, they designed a great site, right? I do care about that. But I think we have to ask ourselves in the design process, why are we doing this? Is it, like I said, is the client asking for this? Are the clients is their audience, do they have some evidence that this is what their audience wants? Most of them probably not, I'm guessing. Or they've seen XYZ feature over here and like, hey, we'd like to have something like that. Well, then let's take it as a challenge as designers to say, hey, we can do something similar to that and stay within these boundaries and do the testing ahead of time to make sure it's going to meet, XYZ criteria out there.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, And uh, just as an example, because I feel like sometimes there is that situation where the client like requests something that you know is wrong, or and then you kind of have to convince, for lack of a better word, convince them to do something else or like why it's wrong, and that can be really challenging. And I feel like that goes back to what you were saying about like not necessarily needing to be an expert, but at least needing to be able to like provide the resources or the information. So one thing I'm thinking of is I have a client now who has had branding and working on their website, and their brand color does not have enough contrast with either black or white on top of it. And so I presented using a slightly darker color so that we could put white on top of it, or put it on top of white. And so we had some back and forth with the brand designer as well, because we didn't want them to think we were just like ignoring their brand guidelines. And we had a lot of conversations about what would be best and like if the audience would even notice and all this stuff. And I ended up saying like ultimately like it's your site, it's your decision, but I am just telling you this information
Right.
basically so that you know. And if you decide to go in this other direction, then it's like you said, Andrea, they have the accessibility statement. They can at least disclose it.
Right, right. We cared about our brand color more than we cared about your experiences. I mean, I hate to be harsh like that, but I mean, at the end of the day, isn't
I
that the
know.
message we're sending, that like we like this color so much that we're sorry we can't see it, right?
We did end up using the darker color.
Yay, yay, that's good. That's good. That sounded really harsh. I don't mean it in a harsh way, but
Well, yeah.
that is absolutely the challenge that we have, is like, how do we get this message through? And for me, sometimes I will literally, I mean, I've had sort of a similar situation. They weren't real set on it, but I just said, I'm going to screenshot the color contrast checker and show you that this isn't going to meet your accessibility criteria. And you know what that translates to? 1 out of 4 people won't be able to read this page.
Mm.
And what if one of those 4 people is your buyer? Like, do you care now? Like, if 1 out of 4 sales you might lose, that's 25% of your audience that you're just saying, okay, sorry, this isn't going to work for you, but we really like this color. So I think there is a gentle way to say that. I would obviously workshop that a whole lot before I had that conversation with a client, but I think it's a great illustration of knowing enough to educate a client. And I would say 8 times out of 10, the client's going to be like, I didn't even think of that. Oh my gosh, absolutely. Let's make sure that it meets, XYZ standards. What else should we be thinking about? I've had so many people say, thank you so much. This really wasn't even on our radar. And they're kind of embarrassed about it. So that's a great example.
Yeah, I've started collecting resources for this kind of stuff. It like so that it's really easy for me to send links to like reputable sources so I don't have to like just like stumble over my words trying to explain it.
Yes, I'm working on a resource like that goes along with my course, so that designers would have sort of a little bit of backup. So I'll probably
Okay,
hit you up, make sure I'm hitting what you're hitting too. But
that's
that's
helpful.
that's a good idea. I think about that with white space. I have an article saved from some blog, I don't know, from forever ago. This still ranks really high if you Google why do I need white space? Because I think 3 out of, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 clients say like there's too much white space. I'm like, here's why we have white space. So
Yeah,
it's
I
the
have
same
like a
thing. Yeah.
presentation, a 1 slide presentation about why you shouldn't use a carousel slideshow of images, that I have like some bullet
Yay!
points and then I have some links to articles. And so whenever anyone
Great.
asks, I just send them that
There you go. Read
with
this
some
first.
context. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh
Um,
boy.
okay, so I guess like on that note, there's also the fact that like after you deliver something to a client, you really can't control what they do after that point. So and
Deep sigh from all the designers on the call. Yes.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I don't know if we might be getting ahead of some people's knowledge of accessibility. Like some people may already know, color contrast and use 1H1. Some people on this call may not. So for context, for example, usually you only want one header one on every page, and it should be the first text on the page, and it should like clearly describe what the page is.
Right.
But sometimes like after you hand it over, the client is going to edit the pages and they might put H3 above H1 at the top, and they might have 4 H1s on the page. So what can we do?
Yeah.
Is there
Deep,
anything
deep
we can
breaths.
do?
Is there anything? Well, this is super timely because I'm in a Facebook group, or we're in the Facebook group together, and they were asking for nonprofit examples. And no joke, like the first four I went to look, I'm like, oh, I could send them this site. And I'm like, oh, what did they do?
Oh,
Oh, what did they do? And it's so disheartening because you work so hard. And not just to make it, look the way you wanted it to look, but to meet all this criteria. And so I'm just be honest, I'm really struggling with this one because I am kind of selling my website design packages on the basis of this. These days, it's the one thing really in my region where a lot of my clients are coming from that's really setting me apart, and people are starting to come to me for my expertise. And so I feel like, we're putting those, I've considered not putting site credits on the site anymore because, 6 months down the road, it's not accessible. It's got my name on the bottom. The average person doesn't know that, like, that's not how I deliver the product. So I think this is a really nuanced topic. Um, a couple of things I would say though. One, I think the more we educate the client throughout the design process, explaining the choices we made and how they relate to accessibility standards, I think that helps. At least we've planted those seeds. So they don't think we just put the H1 up there because we love the way it looked, right? We were very clear about here's the hierarchical order of the headings, and we maybe, whether that's at the site handoff or however you do your offboarding process, we're sort of letting them know. I'm actually working on a template that I can give to my clients that's easy to update, doesn't cause me a lot of extra work at the end of the project, but it sort of summarizes, here are the choices I made because of color contrast. Here are the choices I made because of, site layout and navigation. And so I think that might go a little ways towards helping with this. But I would absolutely update your contracts to be clear that you're not responsible for achieving, for achieving 100% compliance to begin with, because depending on the platform that you're using, that may not even be an option. And two, that once you deliver the site, accessibility is the responsibility of the client. Again, not legal advice. I'm just letting you know, take a look at those contracts and make sure you have some language in there as well. And then your accessibility statement is going to cover some of that as well. So if you've got a statement on the site that says, that's dated, so as of X date, the site was reviewed and delivered, kind of thing, but informs the user that basically the designer, I don't have the exact language on hand, but the designer's not responsible essentially for changes made after a certain date. So I think those are a lot of nuanced steps that you can take. I don't think it's our job to take that on once we deliver it, but I think it's our job throughout the process to educate however we can. Does this make sense? This is kind of a long-winded answer.
yeah, I agree with all of that. And I also think that for me, I will provide resources and I will provide, video tutorials about all that, like only use one H1, do this, don't do this, whatever. And then at that point, I can at least know that I tried and I gave them as much info as I could, and I made the info as digestible and easy and accessible as I could. And if they choose not to do it, like that is not my fault at that point.
Right. Right.
So yeah,
And
I
I
just
would
also like,
keep a hold of those offboarding, any offboarding materials that I give the client in writing. I keep a hold of those with the date. If I were to get a letter, say someone sees my site credit on the site and they contact me instead of the website owner, essentially, you design the site, this is your fault. I'm making all this up. This has never happened. But if it happens, this is your fault. I can go back to that offboarding information. I have screenshots of the site as it was delivered. I have a copy of the accessibility statement, and that I equipped the client to continue that with the resources that it's like every one of my clients gets access to my course for free. So technically they have all of the information at their fingertips that they could go back and use, or, they can come back to me if they have questions. So I feel like that's going to cover my basis. That's between me and my attorney, and this conversation I've had. I don't, other attorneys may handle that differently, but, those are just proactive steps that I take.
yeah. Okay, and so this might answer, I think it was maybe Matt's question about like what do you do when you're like torn between doing something really cool and really unique and branded and different versus something that's accessible.
Yeah. What do you do? What do you do? Yeah, well, and you want me to go first here? Or you want to go, you go
Um,
first. I did a lot of talking already. Yeah.
oh, it's okay. I mean, you have such great points. I, so personally, this is something that I really think about a lot because I think as a designer, I'm kind of known for having a bold, different style that's a little bit more unique and like different from what people are just seeing every day. And so, especially when I just started out, I was constantly thinking about like, how can I do that on websites too? And so I will say, like, in case this resonates with anybody else, one thing that was helpful was to just remember that, like, as a designer, like, you are a creative problem solver and, like, you're given restrictions in many ways. Sometimes it's client feedback or a project brief or a client who comes with brand guidelines that you just don't love, and you have to work within these boundaries. And so I kind of see this in the same way. It's like, these are the things that I shouldn't break. Now, how can I still do something really cool and creative within these confines? And I think like we all can do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think another thing, a lot of times if I find a really cool plugin or a feature or inspiration and I want to do something like that, if I look into it and I don't think it's accessible, I will try to figure out, is there another way I could do something similar, but code it in a better way? Like, and this is one of the benefits I think that I gain from learning code is that I'm not just copy pasting plugins. Like I
Right.
can see how they work. So to an extent, sometimes I can be like, can I maybe just make this a different way? So
Right.
that's been helpful to just be able to like look at the code and kind of have a sense of if it's good, good or not.
Sure. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Those
go
are,
ahead.
I think those are absolutely where you start, right? It starts with sort of, okay, let's earn this title we give ourselves as creative designers, right? We're not somebody who we have to kind of work for that. I think, first of all, I think the other alternative a lot of people just overlook that's really simple is, let's say you really want to do this fancy gallery, right? And galleries are a little tricky, especially with the platform that I work with. They can be a little tricky with accessibility. I think with all platforms, to be honest. And you really want to do this gallery, and it's got hover text, and maybe you click on the photo and it drops down some additional information. Great site feature, probably not going to pass all accessibility checks in some manner. Very simply, you could put all of those photos into a document with all the, so you've got a photo and all of the text, a photo and all of the text, right? Name your document something descriptive. And in that section of the website, give them an alternative thing to click on, right? Here's a PDF version of the gallery. So I just did this for a construction company client. They were really big on before and afters. They really want people to see all this progress, and they wanted this really slick slider, and I think that looks great. And one checker told me it was okay. One checker told me like this is going to cause issues, right? And the way that the hover was working, and I played and played and played with it, and I couldn't get it figured out. So we just did a really nice PDF that I took extra time to make it match the design of the site. Obviously, it had before and afters, that had a little write-up, which is the same thing you could see in the drop-down captions. And then we linked that PDF as an alternate way to view the information on the site. So now, is that particular section 100% accessible? No, but because we offered an alternative way to access the information, we're good. And that's clarified in the accessibility statement. So just an example of offering alternative options. You can do that for almost anything. The most simplest version of that is a map. I have clients that always want a map, and I'm like, you can just click and go to Google Maps and get the map. Like, I don't know that we need maps on the website anymore. Am I wrong? Like, I don't know. I just don't love the map. But if you do a map, technically you're supposed to have written directions as well. And so very easily, if we do the map, we just create a document that has all of the text directions from 4 different directions, from north, south, east, and west. link that next to your map, and you've hit your accessibility criteria. So sometimes, yeah, let's go for the creative thing. Let's do it. And then let's also make sure that somebody who had limitations could access it as well.
That is so
Yeah.
helpful and such a good point. Yeah, I think another thing that maybe could be helpful is to just like lean into other ways to make things look cool. Like instead of trying to do something unique with the way the website works, like can you use color or scale of typography or shapes and forms and icons? Are there other ways that you can bring the brand in and bring design in without like changing the structure of a website? I think
Right.
there are a lot.
Yeah. It just takes a little extra step for sure.
Mhm. So I feel like we have a lot of questions. Do you mind if we
Oh
skip
boy.
to those?
Let's go.
Okay, and everyone who has been asking questions, I have been pasting them in the documents. I appreciate
Awesome.
your questions. Okay, so we had one that was submitted before that was about displaying fine art, images of fine art on a website. Ideally, people would be able to enlarge images on their screens, but that would require larger files, which is a bad idea for loading times and risk of IP being stolen. Any thoughts? Yeah. So my I guess like initial thought is, well, I guess I'm curious, are you if you're thinking about like, do they need to like zoom in on details of the image? Because if not, if it's just a matter of like making the image full screen, if it is sized at no more than 2000 pixels wide at 72 DPI and saved for web, that should load fast enough and not cause any problems. And it should also be large enough that people can view it full screen without it being blurry. And I just had the site open and I forgot what it was already. I'll find it. Well, Andrew, oh no, here it is. Resize Pixel. This is a site that I share with clients that you can easily upload images and just put in 2000 pixels and export them at 72 DPI.
Oh, nice.
And it's really easy to just compress everything for web and know that it'll be large enough as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't know all the details, but I wonder if it's maybe just how the size of the images and how they're being saved. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is, again, you can, if the issue is a site load time, you could do, like Elizabeth said, a reasonable size image on the website itself, but then provide a link to download that image in another format outside of the website, as large as you want to, just make sure that on that download, you're letting them know, like, obviously if it's a PDF or it's, some sort of accessible vehicle to view the image. Again, going back to that, providing information in alternate format.
Yeah. And we may have answered this, but there was a question about horizontal scroll or hover on reveal being never good or only acceptable use. I think you touched on that too, but I was also thinking, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like if it's hover and reveal for like it reveals a cute little icon, that's different from hover and reveal and it reveals important text.
Yes, yeah, I think it's definitely contextual there. What are you revealing? And is that the only way to get that information? Like accordions are a good example. Like accordions pass accessibility standards. Is it kind of, I from what I can tell, they're a little bit more difficult for some people than others to use, but they're intuitive enough, and typically those, if the website platform has that as a built-in feature, that typically has gone through this testing. If you're just using there was a time where there were platforms that didn't even provide that as a native feature and everybody was just coding them. I think a lot of that code was inaccessible code. But now that they're native features, typically the platforms are, being responsible about that. So it depends on what you're revealing on your hover.
Okay, and then there was a question, as far as a lawsuit is concerned, wouldn't you need to show that you made the best accommodations? Should small businesses be concerned that they will be getting sued because their website isn't perfectly in compliance? I feel like we touched on this as well.
Yeah, this is where that accessibility statement can be a huge asset to you and your client. So I help every client draft an accessibility statement go back in my notes because I specifically made a note for myself of what I include in my accessibility statements. The statements basically acknowledge that you've put an effort forth, that you have some cursory knowledge of the law and you have a desire to cooperate. Typically, when you're getting these warning letters or people are posting, a lot of people share the warning letters they've gotten. It's that like, basically like, do you not know anything? Right. And so that accessibility statement says, hey, we're aware of what's going on. We know the law. We're trying our best to cooperate. You want to go ahead and disclose any limitations that you know of. And so if your website platform does not make forms an accessible format, right? Forms are tricky. There are so many accessibility rules about labels and where your form instructions are and form errors. And sometimes platforms are not really giving you all the tools to use. You can just go ahead and disclose that in your statement. We understand this form is not meeting 100% of the criteria. Here's an alternate way to access it. And you could do as many of those as you need them to do that. And then providing very easy to follow contact information. So if you still can't find what you need, we are eager to serve you. Here's how to contact a specific staff member. Here's their email address, their phone number, their mailing address. So you've kind of covered your bases. It's not a get out of jail free card. It's not a do the statement and never do the work. That's sort of my pet peeve is I don't want to see, personally, I don't want to see people just putting a statement on the website and then not trying to make the site, not do what is within their power to do. But that statement can go a long way.
Okay. And then, oh yeah, your preferred screen reader for testing.
Yep. I am pulling up that site right now. It's called VoiceOver. And this is a nice little, it's an older article, but it's still, the last time I checked, it's all still correct. And so I'm going to drop that link in the chat. And it's their step-by-step instructions on how to use the VoiceOver screen reader. So you can use, typically I test in Safari, and you can set all your Safari settings, and then you can actually hear exactly what your site says. It's a really enlightening experience. Do it with your own website. It's a great place to start. Just you'll notice things being read out of order, out of context. You're like, where is that text on the page? Like it's really it's enlightening, and just give yourself a little bit of time to deep dive.
I am excited and nervous about that. Checking that out. Thank you for that link. And then there was also a question about resources about carousels. So I'm just sharing the 2 links that I usually send to clients about this. Okay, and then there's a question, do you think color contrast should be something that is considered when the branded color palette is chosen?
Ideally, yeah, but we're not talking to brand designers today, right? I'm not a brand designer, so Alyssa, you're probably more, I know a lot that are concerned about it, and I know some that clearly are not, so.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like personally, I have always tried to have like what I consider to be like decent color contrast, so like not tone on tone. But since I have started learning more about this is something that I'm trying to be more conscious of, like actually checking when I'm designing the brand. Because whether I'm designing the site or someone else is designing the site, especially now that I've had this one client where we had to go back to the brand designer, I wouldn't want to put one of my clients in that situation. So
Right.
it's something that I am newly thinking about, I would say, now that I'm like learning more about this.
Yeah, we just like we don't have control, right? As website designers, we're often given those guidelines. And so I think if you are friends with brand designers, let them know you attended today. Maybe, point them towards some resources that would be helpful to them, especially just for color contrast, because they really have it a lot easier than we have as brand design or as website designers, right? They're just looking typically at typography and colors, right? Those are the only 2 things that really that it comes down to with the branding. So it's a pretty easy fix to just go to some of these checkers. I mean, there are all kinds of color contrast checkers on the web, and they'll tell you, at X font size, you need, some people, a lot of us know that color contrast is a thing, but the typical contrast ratio is 3:1. It's easy to check that, but if you have smaller text, you're supposed to have 4.5:1, and you can't rely on color to relay specific messages, those kind of things. So there's definitely something I hope catches on and becomes important in that industry as well as our industry.
And then there was also a question about the custom maps. Um, let me find that. Okay. Um, I
Oh, I
think
see it here. Yeah.
you see it, the filterable
Yeah.
map in that particular plugin shop. We're trying not to name specific plugin shops.
Yeah, I don't know.
Um,
I'm not familiar with that one, but I would recommend two things no matter where you're shopping from. So I would ask the person selling the plugin, have you tested this for accessibility? If they have not, then you decide from there whether you want to buy it and test it. They're not likely to give you the code so that you could test it on your own ahead of time. Obviously, because there's no incentive that then you have the code. But I would just ask the person selling it, have you can you show me a live website with this code? Then you can test any website, whether it's yours or not. So then you could test that website, see what errors it's generating, or, just ask them, have you tested it? I am not familiar with that one specifically, however. And then there's a question right under that, Alyssa, that says, is dark mode something that needs to be considered in accessibility? Yes, and I am signed up for a course for this later in July because when I did my certification, that was not covered, which now I know that a lot of platforms are offering those different things and it's kind of overwhelming. So it's my turn to be overwhelmed again. So that is not in my current course, but it's something I'd like to add once I do my own education on that. But absolutely, if somebody's putting the site in dark mode, you've got to know what that's going to look like on their end, and just another thing for us to
wow.
to
Yeah.
be educated about.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. So, well, we have 5 minutes. Do you have any last tips that people, web designers, everyone here could like start implementing today to feel like they are doing their part to make the web more accessible?
Oh boy, yeah. Let me go with two. I think oh boy. It's
Sorry.
like, I think to not face a lot of issues with this with your client at the end of a project, which is what I've heard from a lot of folks. My students in my course have said, I get to the end, they don't like X, Y, and Z, but I did all that for accessibility. Now what do I want to do? I would encourage you to back up all the way to your proposal. What language can you put in your proposal to make sure the client is kind of teed up that this is important to you, why it's important to you as a designer, and why you think it should be important to them. That way, from the very beginning, you're having this conversation. And that can also be something like in a discovery call, asking a question like, are you aware of any, specific physical or cognitive challenges that your audience face? Maybe they have a specific kind of audience that this would be really applicable to. Therapy practices are a great example. Therapy practice often deal with, not deal with, I don't mean it in that way, but often, their clients come to them with a range of maybe they're neurodivergent, maybe there are cognitive issues there, ADHD, ADD, all those kind of things may be more prevalent in a therapy practice. So if that's my client, I want to talk to them about that right off the bat. And that sort of lays that groundwork that this is something we're going to think about when we design your site. So I think that is probably my number one thing. That way you're not facing all of this at the end of a project. And then the second thing is I would say to have your own site audited. It's really, really hard to get in this space and get in this mindset for client work if you haven't done the work on your own website. So use an accessibility checker to audit your own site, pay for an audit if you have the resources to do that, and figure out maybe what on your own site might be a challenge. It's a great way to learn and learn the language, learn the steps to correct it, and then decide what you're going to do, right? Not everyone is going to pursue training and education. Some people might want to stay over here and say like, this is too much. I don't have time. This isn't part of my business. I'm just going to do the basics and have a whole bunch of disclaimers. And then maybe you're somewhere in the middle where you're going to pay for an audit. You're going to learn a little bit, do the best you can. So figure out where you're going to be on that continuum, and then communicate that to your clients.
Mhm. Yeah, I think for me personally, I would say that and I know you said like this is not like the end all be all fix, but I'm really big on like two things, like trying to provide the best service possible, but also like protecting ourselves. So I would say like if there's nothing in your contract about accessibility, like put something in there to protect yourself and like not be liable and like not guarantee compliance, like you said. And again, not legal advice, so consult an attorney if you have
Right.
specific questions about that. And then also just so like I recently went through your course, Andrea, and learned some things that I didn't know before. And I'm trying to like not like kick myself for the things I didn't do on the last site, just know that like for the next site, I'm gonna do these things. And just
Right.
like know that you're like you said, like I am never gonna be like a 100% expert, but I am gonna just do
Yeah.
the best that I can with what I know at the time and try to let
Right.
the client know what I know.
Right. And I think that's what the disability community wants to hear from us. They want to hear that we're putting inclusive products into the world, that we care about it, that we're not intentionally overlooking an audience, and that we're sort of acknowledging our own limitations, but using the resources we have at our disposal, and then just making really good, responsible choices for the world that we're trying to serve. So I know for me, I don't want to put anything else into the world that isn't inclusive. And so that's going to be my barometer, but that's for my stance. And everyone might have a different perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I know a few people are starting to trickle out and we're just about at 2 o'clock. So we wanted to let you know a great resource from Andrea that she just put in the chat. Her Fix Your Accessibility Issues in 5 Days resource for free. So thank you so much for sharing that with
Yes.
everybody.
Yeah, that's just a quick PDF download. It's not the end all be all, but if you don't know where to start and you feel overwhelmed and you're like, okay, yes, I want to care, but I don't know where to start. That is a great, like, just that's what I wish I had had when I started. That's what I created. So
Awesome. Yeah, and Andrea, if you have any other like specific links that you want to share for where people can find you, feel free to share them
oh,
as
sure.
well.
Yeah.
And I will put my links in the chat as well if you'd like to stay in touch. I would love to connect with you on Instagram, Threads. If you're on my newsletter, you can also join me on Boxer. And I do these webinars for designers every other month. So the next one will be in August, and the topic is going to be transitioning from employee to business owner. So if you have not made the jump fully yet, that will be a great conversation. Or if you have made it and they're still in the transition phase, I'm excited to talk to some friends about that. So I'd love to see you there too. But thank you so much again for coming. And thank you, Andrea, for chatting with
You're
us.
welcome.
And so helpful.
Yeah, this is really fun. I could talk about this stuff all day long. So this is definitely just sort of scratching the surface, but happy to answer questions from folks. They can find me on my website there. And yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks everybody.